with two of my friends and colleagues, So-Young Lee and Yusuf Oda. So a brief outline of the presentation. I'll begin by providing a little bit of context for why we decided to do this review in the first place, followed by the research questions and the methods, and an overview of some of the findings. So particularly, I'll talk about some of the general trends we found in this literature, as well as how agency has been positioned in a lot of the good literature on international higher education, followed by a brief sort of conceptual synthesis of agency, and a few points of discussion and limitation. So to provide a little bit of context, the systematic review moved from our observations as researchers focused on agency in higher education. So we all had done PhD projects on the concept of agency in higher education, but in slightly different contexts. And one of the things we found was that agency was often missing or under-conceptualized. That the narrative of deficiency has been published so far on the concept of agency in relation to international students in higher education. The scope of the review. So basically, we decided to focus on international students at the higher education level. So this could be anything from undergraduate all the way through doctoral students. We wanted to focus specifically on what we called student voices, so meaning studies that focused on the experiences of students rather than studies that focused on the perspectives of, say, tutors or lecturers or policymakers. We also used the definition from the OECD of international students to shape our review. So this definition was essentially that international students are those who voluntarily move from their country of origin to another country to pursue a higher education degree. Finally, because one of our aims in the study was to understand how agency is conceptualized in this body of literature, we did not adopt any sort of pre-existing theory or particular definition of agency, but rather decided to take a wide view of the concept and therefore sought to include all relevant studies that addressed agency in any form. So these were the two research questions we came up with. How is agency positioned in the literature on student voices in international higher education? And two, how can the literature on international student agency be conceptually synthesized? So this is an overview of our method. Our search strategy included these following keywords, so different variations of agency, international, higher education, and student. The particular parameters were that we focused on papers as well as books and book chapters published in sort of the 20-year period from 2000 to 2020, all in English. We chose English as that was kind of the common language of our research group, but it is, of course, an inherent limitation of the study as well, as we were missing out on a lot of papers that would be published in other languages. So the particular databases we chose to conduct our searches included Scopus, Web of Science, ProQuest Social Sciences, ERIC, and PsycInfo, which we felt provided good coverage of the literature in a variety of disciplines. After screening our initial 5,237 results, at first the title, abstract, and full text levels, we had a corpus of 53 final papers that we analyzed. At the abstract stage, the exclusion criteria meant that we excluded papers that did not have agency or student perspectives as the clear focus, while at the full text stage, we excluded papers that discussed agency only in relation to particular topics such as language proficiency or agency within one particular class or module. We also decided to exclude papers that focused on short-term study abroad experiences that were less than 1 year, because we're interested in more of the longer-term experience and why people chose to do actual degrees in foreign countries. So in terms of analysis, the papers were categorized based on an iteratively, inductively developed framework that we developed in relation to our first research question that explored how agency was employed in literature. So I'll come back to this particular framework in more detail in the findings section. Each paper was read independently by at least 2 members of the research team, and any discrepancies in the coding framework were discussed as a whole group, and then we made a decision about how to categorize the particular. So before I go into some of the findings that address the specific research questions, I'll present a few general findings from the overall corpus of the literature. So first, in the 20-year span of our lit review, there was a clear increase in the number of papers published addressing international student agency. Although our search parameters included from 2000 to 2020, the earliest papers we found came out in 2002, which is why there's nothing before that in this particular chart. What this graph shows us is an increase in research interest in student agency and international education over the last 2 decades, particularly in the last decade or so, from 2011 onward. And second, although I don't have a particular chart to show for this, of the 53 papers that we included, none of them actually used solely quantitative research designs. Most of them were qualitative research papers, but although I think 4 papers used mixed methods, and there were a few papers that were purely conceptual and didn't focus on analyzing any empirical data. So our initial analysis also revealed a few trends in the populations of students studied. So for instance, 13 papers focused on students from China and/or Taiwan, while the majority of papers included participants from more than one country. Of the studies that focused on participants from a single country, there was a clear emphasis on Chinese students, followed by Thailand and Vietnam and Saudi Arabia. So there was a general focus on Southeast Asian countries in this particular field. This finding aligns with some other research we found that, China is one of the largest, or international students from China is a highly studied population, and also that China is the largest supplier of international students worldwide, according to UNESCO, which links to the increased interest on that particular population. At the same time, our papers primarily focused on Anglophone countries. So, Australia, US, UK, Canada, a few from New Zealand. So this finding also aligns with UNESCO data in showing that Anglophone countries have the largest share of international students. And so having a few East Asian host countries in our sample revealed that East Asia is also attracting a few researcher attention in this particular field. Although, again, most of the host countries were all focused on Anglophone-speaking contexts. So to address the first research question, we developed a framework to guide our coding based on our observations from the full text reading. So the framework reflected ways in which agency appeared or was positioned in the literature, as we realized that agency came up in different places throughout the text, sometimes in the research questions or the theoretical framework, other times in the results or discussion section. We also noted that the term agency was often not well-defined or conceptualized, usually used to indicate intention, but framed as kind of an assumed concept. All this sort of agency or agencies of. So our analysis suggested that in papers in the research object, so explicitly the focus of the study's inquiry as reflected in research aims or questions, agency was used to explore international student agency within a particular relationships, that sort of thing. In papers where agency appeared in the conceptual or theoretical framework, agency was not always necessarily the research focus, but was integrated into the framework to understand sort of student behaviors. So in this particular category, there were a few common theories or framings of agency that were often employed. So for instance, Margaret Archer's conceptualization of agency, Sen, Biesta, and Tedder, 2007, as well as concepts like communities of practice came up quite a lot as a way to kind of talk about agency. In the agency as finding section or category, papers discuss agency not as a focus of the study, but rather found agency as emerging in the results of the study. So for instance, papers on the structure of curriculums in international higher education might be found to influence agency or restrict agency in international students. Or agency often sort of was talked about. So finally, we have agency as given, which means that agency was discussed but not conceptually defined, and therefore appeared to have an assumed meaning. And this was particularly common in papers where agency was sort of an emergent finding. We found this category quite interesting because we felt it highlighted the trend in agency sort of being acknowledged as important in research and international students. But at the same time, because the papers don't explain what they mean by agency, the assumed nature of how agency is employed speaks to the possible emergence of agency as sort of a buzzword, kind of a fashionable concept that is acknowledged widely without being really conceptually explored. Finally, we had a very small category called agency in passing. And this is basically where agency would sort of appear briefly in like literature review or discussion sections of papers without any real elaboration. And so it was sort of acknowledged, but really quite peripheral to the study. So there were a few of those, but they didn't really contribute much to our overall analysis. So in order to address our second research question on how the literature might be conceptually synthesized, we developed a framework by reviewing the study's different conceptualizations of agency and the ways in which they may overlap or differ. And so we created this resulting framework here. So as shown here, there appear to be two major functions of international student agency. The first was work on the self, which includes self-reflection or self-regulation based in one's own self-knowledge, which enables a person to sort of take action in relation to their desires and goals. A second function was work on the environment, so sort of agency as allowing students to resist or accept or exploit their different environments that they're navigating. In turn, agency, of course, was linked to structure, which could restrict or foster or reproduce different forms of agency. In the international higher education context, structures included things like, cultural context, language, educational and institutional systems, as well as disciplinary communities of practice. So agency was thus often conceptualized in relation to structure. And so exploring how international student agency enables students to negotiate these various structures in relation to their own personal goals and desires. Finally, the literature suggested the existence of these sociocultural mediators. So these are sort of factors which refer to what students bring with them into a new context and what that new context in host countries can offer them. And so the literature suggests that international students' agency is often fostered or restricted by cultural capital, personal values, aspirations, and language abilities, so a whole range of different factors. But these are resources that can also be employed when students exercise agency within these new environments of their host countries. Finally, it's important to note that a number of studies in this review highlighted students' use of agency in navigating challenges. And so from this perspective, interactions with new academic, cultural, and social settings in higher education were positioned not as a barrier for success, but actually as a way of helping students to further develop their agency. And so we thought this might speak to why certain moments or types of interactions like supervisor meetings or experiences communicating with peers and professors from different cultures were frequently studied sort of contexts for international student agency, because it really sort of could show why these particular types of interactions presented challenges that could then be overcome or navigated in certain ways by employing different types of agency. So there were a few discussion points from the paper that I'll highlight. As presented in the review, the literature interpreted a range of student actions as agentic and a lack of consistency in conceptualizing and defining agency. Papers that did conceptualize agency adopted a range of frameworks and rarely built upon the work of others. So there was sort of a lack of shared understanding about what agency means. But we thought that this was also reflective of, the fact that perhaps agency is sort of a developing concept, and so it might take time for sort of more acknowledged or several sort of key frameworks to really come out that are used consistently in literature. However, overall, our analysis suggested that student agency appears to manifest in actions that are both internal and external, acting on both the self and the environment. Finally, there were a couple things that we thought were quite interesting in terms of self-reflexivity and self-regulation aspects of agency, which the literature suggested may facilitate personal growth and identity development. So there were a few papers that employed concepts like self-formation and agency for becoming, which present ways in which agency and self-development are entwined. So beyond sort of educational growth, there were a few papers that highlighted the ways in which, for international students, the use of agency in this international context can really develop the self kind of on a more broad level. And finally, the literature suggested that agency might lead to larger structural changes in environments that the students are located in, because as students adjust and in small ways alter and reconstruct the environments that they navigate in higher education. And they can do this by doing things like generating new knowledge by the types of research that they do, the particular concepts that they bring in to study particular different populations and problems. And also just by having more international students in a classroom, you can help to create a more global and diverse learning environment. And so these are small ways in which international students are also impacting the contexts for their host countries as well. So a few limitations to highlight. As I mentioned earlier, because our literature search was conducted in English, we likely missed many other publications from other languages. And of course, similarly, the corpus of papers was limited by our choice of databases and keyword selection. So for instance, we discussed the fact that possibly there were other papers that were essentially writing about the same thing, about agency, but perhaps used slightly different language that we didn't quite capture in that particular search. In terms of future research, we found that there was a lack of longitudinal studies on agency development in international higher education students. And so this might be a useful area for future work to understand how agency develops and or changes over time. And also, as mentioned earlier, there was a clear focus on international students studying in Anglophone host countries. And although there is a small but growing number of papers focusing on East Asian host countries, we felt that additional studies looking at these other contexts would be really useful in understanding this topic. Thank you very much.